Welcome to the darkest corners of the internet, where fear takes form and nightmares come alive. If you crave spine-chilling tales and haunting mysteries, you've found your new home. Before we dive into today's terrifying story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Don't forget to like this video if it sends shivers down your spine, and share it with your bravest friends, if they dare. We'd love to hear your thoughts or theories in the comments below, so don't hold back. Now, turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare for a journey into the unknown. Let's begin. I always loved the woods behind my house. They were my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the noise of the world. That evening, the air was crisp, and the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees. I had my headphones on, listening to my favorite playlist as I strolled along the familiar path. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the faint scent of pine lingered in the air. The woods were alive with their usual symphony, and I felt at ease. But then, I noticed something odd. The forest seemed quieter than usual. The birds had stopped singing suddenly, as if silenced by an unseen force. I paused for a moment, pulling out my headphones to listen more carefully. The silence was deafening, unnatural, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of the silence. That's when I saw it. A tall, thin figure standing motionless among the trees. It was far away, too far to make out any details, but its silhouette was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I squinted to get a better look. At first, I thought it might be a tree or a trick of the light playing games with my mind. But then it moved, just slightly, and I froze in place. Its movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical, as if it was observing me from afar. My breath caught in my throat as an inexplicable dread washed over me. I wanted to run but found myself rooted to the spot, unable to look away from that eerie figure in the distance. I forced myself to turn away and walk back toward my house, but unease clung to me like a second skin. My footsteps felt too loud against the forest floor as they crunched over leaves and twigs. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure following me. But it wasn't there, or at least I couldn't see it anymore. The forest seemed darker now, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the ground, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. By the time I reached my backyard, my hands were trembling and cold sweat dripped down my back. When I finally stepped onto my porch and looked at my watch, confusion set in. Only 15 minutes had passed since I left for my walk, but it felt like hours had gone by in that suffocating silence of the woods. The sky was darker than it should have been for that time of evening. Streaks of deep orange and purple painted the horizon as if night had arrived early just for me. As I stepped into my house and locked the door behind me, an eerie chill settled over me that no amount of warmth could shake off. It felt like something, or someone, was still watching me from those trees. That night was when everything changed for good. I dreamed of him, the tall man with no face, standing at the foot of my bed in complete silence. His long arms hung limply at his sides before they began to stretch unnaturally toward me as I lay paralyzed with fear. His presence was suffocating. Even in my dream, I could feel his coldness seep into my bones like ice water running through my veins. When I woke up drenched in sweat and gasping for air, my bedroom window was wide open, even though I was certain I had closed it before going to sleep. The whispers started soon after that night. Soft at first but growing louder with each passing day until they were impossible to ignore. Sometimes they sounded like my name being called from far away. Other times they were unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. They followed me wherever I went, in school hallways, at work breaks, even during moments when everything else around me was silent. My friends began to notice how pale and tired I looked. They asked if everything was okay, but how could I explain what was happening without sounding insane? A week later came the news that shook me to my core. Jake, my best friend since childhood, had disappeared. We'd been at a party near the woods that night, celebrating his birthday. He'd gone outside for some air, saying he needed to clear his head after a few drinks. At first, No one noticed he was gone. We assumed he was just taking a walk or talking to someone outside. But as the hours passed and he didn't return, people started to worry. His phone went straight to voicemail, and his car was still parked in the driveway. Panic set in when we realized he wasn't answering texts or calls. A search party was organized the next morning, combing through every inch of the woods near where he was last seen. I joined them, my heart pounding with every step deeper into the forest. But there was no trace of him, not even a footprint. The police suggested he might have run away or gotten lost, but I knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had seen in those woods had taken him. The thought haunted me, and guilt gnawed at my insides like a parasite. Maybe if I had warned him about what I'd seen, he would still be here. I couldn't stay away from the woods after Jake vanished. It felt like they were calling me back. It wasn't just guilt driving me, it was something deeper, an almost magnetic pull I couldn't resist. One evening, just before sunset, I grabbed a flashlight and some pepper spray and ventured into the trees alone. The air was heavy with moisture, and an unnatural stillness hung over the forest like a shroud. Every step felt like a violation, as though I were trespassing on sacred ground. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the forest itself didn't want me there. Then I saw them, carvings on tree trunks depicting strange symbols and stick figures with elongated limbs. Some of them looked fresh, as if they'd been etched into the bark only hours ago. My heart raced as I traced one of the symbols with my fingers, feeling its rough edges under my touch. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through my bones. The hum grew louder with each passing second until it became almost unbearable. My flashlight began to flicker uncontrollably before dying completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with the light, but no matter how many times I clicked it on and off, it wouldn't work. That's when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, crunching over leaves and twigs with an eerie precision. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, expecting to see another hiker or maybe an animal. But there was no one there, just shadows stretching unnaturally long across the ground under the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the trees. Then he appeared, tall and impossibly thin, his featureless face staring directly at me from only a few feet away. I don't remember what happened next. Everything went black after that moment. When I woke up hours later, I was lying on my front porch with no memory of how I got there or what had happened in those missing hours. My clothes were torn and covered in dirt. My hands were scratched and bleeding as if I'd been clawing at something, or someone, to escape. My flashlight was gone, and so were any traces of what had occurred in those woods that night. But something felt different, off, as though part of me had been left behind in that forest. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights filled with whispers and fleeting glimpses of his figure outside my window. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far. Every creak of floorboards sounded like footsteps approaching my room. I could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on me, suffocating and relentless. I became obsessed with the idea that he was always watching, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. My mind spiraled into dark places, replaying every moment in the woods over and over again. I started keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence, every whisper that echoed in the silence of my home. The pages filled quickly with frantic scrawls, sketches of the figure I had seen, and notes about the whispers that haunted me. I would sit up late into the night, the glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows that danced on the walls, and I would write until my hand ached. The act of writing felt like my only tether to reality, a way to make sense of what was happening, or at least try to. My friends noticed the change in me. They said I looked like a ghost, pale and drawn, with dark circles under my eyes. I tried to explain, to share the terror that gripped me, but they dismissed it as stress or fatigue. I felt isolated, trapped in my own mind, where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. One night, as I was writing, I heard a soft tapping at my window. My heart raced as I turned to look, half expecting to see him standing there, his faceless gaze fixed on me. But it was just the wind rustling the branches of the trees outside, or so I told myself. Still, the fear lingered, a constant companion that refused to leave. Desperate for answers, I began to research Slenderman online, diving deep into forums and articles late into the night. The more I read, the more I felt connected to others who had experienced similar horrors. People who had vanished or succumbed to madness after seeing him. It was as if I was being drawn into a web of terror that I couldn't escape. I became obsessed with confronting him, convinced that understanding what he wanted might set me free. The thought terrified and exhilarated me, a dangerous thrill coursing through my veins. As days turned into weeks, my obsession deepened. The whispers grew louder, shadows crept closer, and I knew that soon I would have no choice but to face whatever awaited me in those woods. While helping Jake's family clean out his room weeks after his disappearance, we found something strange, an old notebook shoved under his bed. It was battered and torn at the edges as if it had been handled roughly, or hidden in haste. His mother handed it to me without much thought, but as soon as I touched it, an icy chill ran down my spine. Something about it felt wrong, like it shouldn't exist in this world at all. I opened it slowly, flipping through pages filled with disturbing sketches and cryptic notes scrawled in Jake's familiar handwriting. There were drawings of tall figures with elongated limbs standing among trees, figures eerily similar to what I had seen in the woods. Some pages had symbols carved into them with such force that they tore through the paper. Others were covered in frantic sentences like, "He's watching, don't look directly at him," and asterisk, "the woods are alive." Asterisk. The deeper I delved into the notebook, the more unsettling it became. One page contained a map of our town with strange markings near locations where people had gone missing over the years, including Jake's last known location near the woods. Another page described dreams he'd been having, dreams eerily similar to mine about a faceless man standing at his bedside. I couldn't stop reading despite the growing sense of dread clawing at my chest. It felt like Jake had left this for me, as if he knew something terrible was coming and wanted me to be prepared. But prepared for what? As I reached the final pages of the notebook, one phrase repeated over and over again, asterisk, "He's coming." Asterisk. The notebook consumed my thoughts for days after finding it. Every word felt like a warning, a message from Jake beyond wherever he had gone. The symbols etched into its pages haunted me. They seemed to pulse with an energy all their own whenever I stared at them for too long. I decided there was no turning back now. I had to return to the woods one last time and confront whatever was waiting for me there. Armed with Jake's notebook, a flashlight, and a knife, though deep down I knew it would be useless, I ventured out just before sunset. The forest greeted me with an oppressive silence that seemed even heavier than before, as if it knew why I had come back. Each step felt like walking deeper into another world, a place where time didn't exist and reality bent under unseen forces. As night fell completely around me, my flashlight began flickering again just like before, but this time there were no footsteps behind me. Only whispers growing louder until they became deafening screams inside my head. When he appeared this time, tall and featureless against the moonlit trees, I didn't run or scream. Instead, I stood frozen in place as he moved closer without ever truly moving at all. His presence was overwhelming, a void where nothing should exist yet somehow did, and as he loomed over me. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. My boyfriend, Alex, and I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and chirping birds. We unpacked quickly, eager to enjoy the tranquility. The cabin was cozy, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and a fireplace that promised warmth on chilly nights. It was perfect, or so I thought. That first evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a strange unease settle over me. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness, their shadows long and foreboding. I shook it off as paranoia and focused on Alex's laughter as he told a joke. But deep down, something about the forest didn't feel right. The next morning, we decided to explore the woods around the cabin. The air was crisp, and sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns on the forest floor. We walked for hours, taking in the beauty of nature, until Alex stopped abruptly. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a tree trunk. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, circles intersecting with lines and what looked like stick figures with elongated limbs. "Probably kids messing around," Alex said with a shrug, but I wasn't so sure. The carvings looked old, yet there was something deliberate about them that sent a chill down my spine. As we continued walking, we found more trees marked with similar symbols. They seemed to form a path leading deeper into the forest. When we returned to the cabin later that afternoon, something felt off. The door was slightly ajar even though we had locked it before leaving. "Maybe it didn't latch properly," Alex suggested as he pushed it open cautiously. Inside, everything seemed untouched, except for one thing. A single piece of paper lying on the kitchen table that hadn't been there before. It was blank except for a symbol drawn in black ink, the same symbol we'd seen carved into the trees earlier. My stomach twisted as Alex tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably left by someone who had rented the cabin before us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been inside while we were gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin's wooden walls sounded like footsteps creeping closer. Alex was snoring softly beside me, completely at ease, but I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from outside our window. My heart raced as I sat up in bed and peered through the curtains into the darkness beyond. At first, I saw nothing but trees swaying gently in the wind. But then my eyes adjusted to the dim light of the moon, and I saw him, a tall figure standing motionless among the trees at the edge of our clearing. I froze in place, unable to look away from him. He was impossibly tall and thin, his arms hanging limply at his sides like dead weight. His face, or lack thereof, was blank and featureless, yet somehow it felt like he was staring directly at me. My chest tightened as fear took hold of me completely. I wanted to wake Alex but couldn't bring myself to move or make a sound. It felt like if I did, he would come closer. When morning finally came after what felt like an eternity of terror-filled silence, I was still sitting upright in bed, clutching the blanket tightly around me. The figure had disappeared sometime during the night, but the memory of him lingered like a dark shadow in my mind. Alex woke up cheerful, completely unaware of what I had seen. I debated whether to tell him but decided against it. I didn't want him to think I was losing my mind. Instead, I suggested we leave the cabin early and head back home. "Come on," Alex said with a grin. "We've got 2 more nights here. Don't let the woods freak you out." His words felt dismissive, but I didn't push further. Still, every creak of the cabin and every rustle outside made me jump as the day dragged on. While Alex was chopping wood outside that afternoon, I decided to tidy up the cabin and keep myself busy. That's when I found it, a small leather-bound journal tucked under the bed. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting inside was frantic and uneven. The entries spoke of strange sightings in the woods, tall figures with no faces, whispers that came from nowhere, and dreams that left the writer waking up screaming. My hands trembled as I read further, realizing that whoever had written this journal had stayed in this very cabin years ago. The last entry sent chills down my spine. "He watches from the trees. He's always there, waiting. If you see him, don't look away." That night, as Alex slept soundly beside me once again, I lay awake with the journal clutched to my chest. The words replayed in my mind over and over. Asterisk, he's always there, waiting. Asterisk, around midnight, I heard it, a faint whisper coming from just outside the cabin walls. It wasn't words exactly, but a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest outside was still and dark, but I could feel something watching me from just beyond the tree line. The next morning, I finally told Alex everything. The figure I'd seen that first night, the journal I'd found under the bed, and the whispers that kept me awake at night. He listened patiently but didn't seem convinced. "You're just scaring yourself," he said with a reassuring smile. "These woods are old. They creak and groan all the time. And that journal? Probably just someone trying to write a spooky story." His rational explanations did little to ease my fear. Deep down, I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't something you could explain away with logic. Later that day, We went for another walk through the woods despite my protests. Alex insisted it would help me relax and prove there was nothing to be afraid of. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, we started seeing them again. The strange carvings on tree trunks that seemed to form a path leading somewhere unknown. "This is weird," Alex admitted as he traced one of the symbols with his fingers. For once, he seemed uneasy too. The air grew colder as we followed the trail of markings deeper into the woods until we came across something that made my blood run cold. A clearing filled with dozens of trees covered in those same symbols. The clearing felt wrong, like we had stepped into another world entirely. The air was heavy and still. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place. In the center of it all stood an old wooden structure, a small shack that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "Let's check it out," Alex said before I could protest. Reluctantly, I followed him toward the shack, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The door creaked loudly as Alex pushed it open, revealing a dark interior filled with dust and cobwebs. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we stepped inside cautiously. On a table in the center of the room lay more symbols carved into its surface, along with what looked like crude drawings of a tall figure surrounded by trees. That night back at the cabin felt darker than any before. The forest outside seemed alive, shifting and breathing in ways I couldn't explain. Alex tried to distract me with a card game by the fireplace, but I could barely focus. My mind kept drifting back to the clearing, to the shack, and to the crude drawings of that tall figure etched into the table. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there, motionless yet impossibly menacing. As the hours passed, the cabin's cozy warmth began to feel suffocating. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its light didn't seem to reach the corners of the room. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Around midnight, the whispers started again, low and guttural, coming from just outside the cabin walls. This time, Alex heard them too. He froze mid-sentence, his face pale as he turned toward the window. "What is that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt dry, and my body was paralyzed with fear. The whispers grew louder, almost rhythmic, as if they were calling out to us. Then came the tapping, a slow, deliberate knock on the window pane behind us. We both turned at once, but there was nothing there, just darkness pressing against the glass like a living thing. The tapping didn't stop, it grew more insistent, echoing through the cabin like a heartbeat. Alex grabbed a flashlight and motioned for me to stay put as he moved toward the window. "Don't," I whispered urgently, grabbing his arm, but he shook me off gently. "It's probably just an animal," he said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. He shone the flashlight out into the darkness beyond the window, its beam cutting through the night like a knife. For a moment, there was nothing, just trees swaying in the wind and shadows dancing in their wake. But then we saw him, the tall figure standing at the edge of the clearing, his featureless face turned directly toward us. Alex stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as it clattered to the floor. What is that?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't speak. My entire body was frozen in terror as I stared at the faceless man who seemed closer now than before, though he hadn't moved at all. The whispers grew louder until they were deafening, filling my head with an unbearable pressure that made me want to scream. We didn't sleep that night. We couldn't. Alex barricaded the door with furniture while I sat huddled in a corner clutching Jake's journal like it was a lifeline. The whispers continued outside, circling the cabin like predators stalking their prey. Every so often, we'd hear footsteps crunching over leaves or see shadows flit past the windows, shadows too tall and thin to belong to any human being. As dawn approached, we decided we couldn't stay any longer. We had to leave before whatever was out there decided to come inside. But when we opened the door to make our escape, we found something waiting for us on the porch, another piece of paper with that same symbol drawn on it in black ink. We ran without looking back, abandoning everything we'd brought with us except for Jake's journal and my phone, which I used to call for help once we reached town hours later. But even now, weeks after escaping those woods, I can still feel him watching me from somewhere just beyond my sight. The nightmares haven't stopped either, Dreams of endless forests and faceless men who whisper my name in voices that aren't my own. Sometimes I wake up in bed with dirt under my fingernails or leaves tangled in my hair as though I've been wandering through those woods again in my sleep. And sometimes, I see him standing at the edge of my dreams or outside my window late at night, waiting for me to return. I worked as a night security guard at an old elementary school that had been closed for years. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was quiet, and I liked the solitude. The halls were eerily silent at night, with only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights to keep me company. My shift started like any other. I made my rounds, checking that all the doors were locked and the windows secured. The playground outside was overgrown with weeds, the swings creaking softly in the wind. It was peaceful in its own way, even if it felt a little lonely. But that night, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, as I sat in my office scrolling through my phone, I heard it, a faint sound coming from outside. It was rhythmic, almost melodic, like the squeak of a swing moving back and forth. I froze for a moment, listening intently. The playground was supposed to be empty. No one had set foot on it in years. Grabbing my flashlight, I headed toward the window that overlooked the yard. Sure enough, one of the swings was moving, slowly and deliberately, as if someone were sitting on it. But there was no one there. My stomach tightened as I stared into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. I told myself to ignore it and return to my desk, but my nerves were already on edge. Minutes later, I heard another sound, this time louder and closer. It was a soft scraping noise coming from down the hall near one of the classrooms. My heart raced as I grabbed my flashlight again and stepped into the hallway. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of lockers and dusty floors. That's when I saw it, a shadow at the far end of the hall. It was tall and thin, much taller than any person should be, and it didn't move like a normal shadow should. Instead of stretching naturally along the wall or floor, it seemed to stand upright, detached from any source. I followed the shadow down the hall until it disappeared into one of the classrooms. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob and pushed it open slowly. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. Desks were scattered haphazardly across the floor, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust. But something felt off about this room. It was colder than the rest of the building, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. As I scanned the room with my flashlight, my eyes landed on something carved into one of the desks, a crude stick figure with unnaturally long limbs. I backed out of the classroom quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I turned to head back to my office, I heard them, whispers echoing softly through the empty halls. They weren't words exactly, but low murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight flickered briefly before going out completely, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled with it, desperate for light in this suffocating void. When my flashlight finally came back on, I found myself standing near one of the exits that led to the playground outside. The whispers had stopped abruptly but were replaced by another sound, the creaking swing again. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, I pushed open the door and stepped into the cool night air. The playground looked exactly as it had earlier, overgrown with weeds and bathed in moonlight. But this time, there was someone sitting on that swing, a tall figure with impossibly long arms hanging limply at its sides. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the figure sitting on the swing. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, as if the air around it had grown heavier. The figure was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, with fingers that seemed to stretch endlessly. Its face, or lack thereof, was the most horrifying part. There were no features, just a blank, pale surface that seemed to absorb the moonlight. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The swing creaked rhythmically as it swayed back and forth, though there was no wind. Then, without warning, the figure's head tilted slightly in my direction, as if it had noticed me. I don't remember making the decision to run. My body acted on instinct. I turned and bolted back toward the school building, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate at first but growing faster with each passing second. They didn't sound human. They were too heavy, too loud, like something enormous was chasing me. I reached the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then came the knocking, slow and deliberate taps against the glass window of the door. I didn't dare look back. Back in my office, I locked the door and turned on the security camera monitors, desperate for some sense of control. The cameras showed various parts of the school, empty hallways, dark classrooms, and the playground outside. My heart sank when I saw it, the figure standing motionless in front of the door I had just locked. It didn't move or try to get inside. It simply stood there, staring into the camera with its blank face. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It raised one long arm and pointed directly at the camera. Directly at me. Before I could process what was happening, the power went out completely. The monitors flickered off. Even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights vanished. I was plunged into total darkness, with only my flashlight to guide me. The whispers started again, soft at first but growing louder and more insistent until they filled every corner of my mind. It felt like they were coming from inside my head rather than outside of it. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I stayed in my office for what felt like hours, too terrified to move or make a sound. The whispers continued relentlessly, punctuated by occasional knocks on the walls or floor that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate like before, but when I peeked through the small glass window, there was nothing there. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but every option seemed impossible. The exits led back to the playground where he was waiting. Staying inside felt equally dangerous. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. Clutching my flashlight tightly in one hand and a crowbar I'd found in a supply closet in the other, I stepped cautiously into the hallway. The air felt colder than before. Each breath came out in visible puffs of mist despite it being a warm night outside. As I crept down the hall toward an emergency exit on the far side of the building, my flashlight flickered again before going out entirely. That's when I saw him, standing at the end of the hallway under a flickering light fixture. He didn't move or make a sound. He just stood there with his arms hanging limply at his sides like before. For reasons I still can't explain, I didn't run this time. I couldn't. It felt like an invisible force was holding me in place as he began to move toward me slowly but deliberately. His movements were unnatural, jerky yet fluid at the same time, and his featureless face seemed to shift slightly as he approached. When he was only a few feet away from me, I could feel the air around me change. It grew colder, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was being drained of life. My body refused to move, locked in place by an invisible force. His blank face was horrifying up close, a smooth and pale void that seemed to pull my gaze into its emptiness. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It was as though my voice had been stolen. The whispers grew louder in my head, overlapping and echoing until they became unbearable. Then, without warning, he tilted his head to one side, as if studying me. His long arms began to rise slowly, the fingers stretching toward me like claws. I finally managed to break free from whatever was holding me in place and stumbled backward, falling hard onto the cold floor. As I scrambled to my feet, the figure stopped moving and stood completely still once more. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I turned and ran as fast as I could down the hallway toward the emergency exit. My flashlight flickered back to life just long enough to guide me through the darkness, but I didn't dare look back. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic with each step I took. When I finally reached the door, I slammed into it with all my weight, pushing it open and bursting out into the cool night air. The playground stretched out before me, eerily quiet under the pale light of the moon. The swings were still now, as if nothing had ever disturbed them. My car was parked just beyond the fence, and it felt like salvation was within reach. But as I sprinted across the yard, I felt a presence behind me. An oppressive weight that made every step harder than the last. It was as though the air itself was trying to pull me back toward him. I reached my car and fumbled with my keys, dropping them twice before finally unlocking the door and throwing myself inside. My hands shook violently as I started the engine and sped away from the school without looking back. The whispers faded as I put distance between myself and that cursed place, but their echo lingered in my mind like a haunting melody I couldn't forget. I quit my job the next day without explanation and vowed never to return to that school or its playground again. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching me, waiting for the right moment to appear again. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and still, I hear faint whispers outside my window or see shadows that don't belong. I've started dreaming about him too. Dreams where I'm back in that hallway or standing on the playground under a pale moonlight that feels too cold to be real. And every time, he's there, tall and silent with his blank face turned toward me. I don't know what he wants or why he chose me, but one thing is certain. You can leave the place where you saw him, but you can never truly escape him. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun and adventure. My friends, Mia, Eric, and I, had planned a hiking trip deep in the mountains. We'd been talking about it for weeks, eager to escape the city and reconnect with nature. The trail we chose was remote, winding through dense forests and leading to a secluded lake where we planned to camp for 2 nights. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, fresh air, and the sound of birds chirping around us. We laughed, took photos, and enjoyed the beauty of the wilderness. But as evening approached, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The forest seemed too quiet, as if the usual sounds of nature had been swallowed by something unseen. When we reached our campsite near the lake, we unpacked our gear and set up the tents. Mia was in charge of navigation, but when she went to check the map, it was gone. "I swear I had it in my bag," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. Eric shrugged it off, saying we could just follow the trail markers on our way back. I tried to laugh along with him, but something about losing the map felt wrong, like it wasn't an accident. As night fell, the unease I'd felt earlier grew stronger. The forest around us seemed darker than it should have been, and the stillness was unnerving. That night, as we sat around the campfire telling stories, I kept glancing into the trees surrounding our campsite. The firelight didn't reach far into the dense forest, leaving shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. "You're jumpy tonight," Mia said with a grin. "Afraid of bears?" I forced a smile and shook my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When it was time to sleep, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tightly, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to a strange sound, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. The next morning, I mentioned the sound to Mia and Eric over breakfast, but neither of them had heard anything unusual. As we packed up our gear to explore more of the trail leading deeper into the forest, Eric stopped suddenly and pointed at something on the ground near our campsite. Footprints. They were large, too large to belong to any of us, and they led away from our campsite into the woods. "Probably a hunter or another hiker," Eric said dismissively, though his voice lacked conviction. But when we followed them for a short distance out of curiosity, they abruptly stopped in the middle of a clearing with no sign of where they went next. The clearing was unsettling, an open space surrounded by trees so tall they seemed to block out the sky above. In its center stood an old wooden structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. "What is this doing all the way out here?" Mia asked as we approached cautiously. The building was small and weathered, its walls covered in strange carvings similar to symbols I'd seen in old folklore books. Circles intersecting with lines and stick figures with elongated limbs. Against my better judgment, we decided to go inside. The door creaked loudly as Eric pushed it open, revealing a single room filled with dust and cobwebs. In one corner stood a table covered in papers, maps marked with strange symbols and notes written in frantic handwriting that was difficult to read. One phrase stood out clearly on several pages. Asterisk, "Don't look at him." Asterisk, my stomach churned as I tried to make sense of what we were seeing. As I sifted through the papers on the table, My hands trembled. The repeated phrase, "don't look at him," was scrawled in different sizes and intensities, as though whoever wrote it had been desperate to get the message across. Mia picked up one of the maps and frowned. "These symbols," she said, pointing to the strange markings scattered across the page, "they look like they're marking places in the forest. But what do they mean?" Eric, ever the skeptic, waved it off. "Probably just some crazy hermit who used to live here," he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. I wanted to leave immediately, but Mia insisted we take the map with us. "It might help us find our way back," she reasoned. Reluctantly, I agreed, though every instinct told me we were making a mistake. As we left the cabin and continued deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt colder despite the sun still shining faintly through the canopy above. The trail became harder to follow, overgrown with weeds and roots that seemed to twist deliberately underfoot. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees ahead of us. It was tall and thin, its movements unnaturally smooth as it glided silently through the forest. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Mia and Eric looked at me quizzically, but before I could explain, Eric pointed ahead. "There's something carved into that tree." We approached cautiously and found another symbol etched into the bark, a stick figure with impossibly long limbs. It was identical to the ones we'd seen in the cabin. "This is getting weird," Mia muttered, her earlier confidence replaced by unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we pressed on, following what we thought was the trail back toward our campsite, it began to disappear. The markers we'd been using to navigate were gone, replaced by unmarked trees that all looked eerily similar. Panic started to set in as we realized we were lost. "This doesn't make sense," Mia said, her voice shaking. "We didn't come this way." Eric tried to stay calm, suggesting we retrace our steps, but every direction felt wrong, as if the forest itself had shifted around us. The whispers began soon after that, soft and distant at first but growing louder with each passing moment. By late afternoon, we were exhausted and desperate to find our way out of the forest. We decided to rest for a moment in a small clearing while Eric climbed a nearby hill to get a better view of our surroundings. He promised he'd be back in 10 minutes. But 10 minutes turned into 20, then 30, and there was no sign of him. We called his name repeatedly, our voices echoing through the trees with no response. Mia's face was pale as she clutched my arm tightly. "He wouldn't just leave us," she whispered. I nodded, trying to stay calm even as fear clawed at my chest. We decided to search for him together, heading in the direction he had gone earlier. But as we walked, something strange happened. The forest seemed darker than before, even though it wasn't yet evening. The trees loomed taller and closer together, their branches intertwining above us like a cage. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darting between trees or a flicker of something impossibly tall standing just beyond my line of sight. Then we saw it, standing motionless at the edge of a clearing ahead of us. A tall figure with unnaturally long limbs and no face. My blood ran cold as I grabbed Mia's hand and pulled her behind a tree for cover. We watched in silence as it stood there for what felt like an eternity before turning slowly and disappearing into the woods without making a sound. Mia was shaking uncontrollably by this point. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to me desperately. "What is happening?" she whispered through sobs. I didn't have an answer, only fear that whatever had taken Eric would come for us next. Mia refused to move after seeing the figure. She clung to my arm, her breathing shallow and ragged. "We need to go," I whispered, trying to sound braver than I felt. But she shook her head violently. "We're not safe anywhere," she said, her voice barely audible. I tried to pull her along, but she seemed frozen in place, her eyes darting around the forest as if expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. The whispers returned then, louder and closer than before. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding us like a sinister chorus. Finally, Mia snapped out of her paralysis and began walking quickly, almost running, in the direction we thought might lead us back to the trailhead. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest grew darker with each step, the trees closing in around us like a living wall. Just when I thought we might have escaped whatever was stalking us, Mia stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I strained my ears but heard nothing at first. Then it came, heavy footsteps crunching over leaves and twigs behind us. We turned together, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching unnaturally long across the forest floor. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her forward. We sprinted through the trees, branches clawing at our faces and arms as we stumbled over roots and rocks. The footsteps followed us, growing louder and faster with each passing second. Then Mia screamed, a blood-curdling sound that made me stop in my tracks and turn around. She was gone. One moment she'd been right behind me, her hand gripping mine tightly. The next, there was only empty space where she had been standing. "Mia!" I shouted desperately, my voice echoing through the forest. But there was no answer, only silence broken by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. My flashlight flickered weakly as I scanned the area around me, searching for any sign of her. That's when I saw it. A tall figure standing just beyond the reach of my light, its featureless face turned directly toward me. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at him. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as fear rooted me to the spot. The whispers returned, louder than ever now, filling my head with words I couldn't understand but somehow felt compelled to obey. Slowly, the figure began to move toward me, not walking but gliding silently over the ground like a shadow come to life. I turned and ran blindly through the forest, tears streaming down my face as panic overtook me completely. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I didn't dare stop until I burst out onto a familiar trail, the one leading back to the parking lot where we'd started our hike 2 days earlier. When I reached my car, I found it exactly as we'd left it, except for one thing. A piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper with a single phrase written on it in shaky handwriting. Asterisk, don't look at him. Asterisk. I drove away without looking back, leaving everything behind. Our gear, our tents, and my friends. Weeks later, search parties combed through those woods but found no trace of Mia or Eric, or any sign that we'd ever been there at all. Even now, I can still hear the whispers sometimes when I'm alone at night, or see shadows moving just beyond my line of sight that don't belong to anything human. I know he's still out there, and he's waiting for me to return.